Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? I had been walking home from work, the city streets glistening from the evening rain, each droplet reflecting the harsh glare of streetlights. The sound of water splashing under my shoes mixed with the hum of distant traffic, creating a rhythm that I found oddly comforting. It was the kind of night that made the world feel both intimate and strange, like every shadow could hold a secret I wasn't meant to see. I kept my hands in my pockets, my coat pulled tight against the chill, and tried to focus on the familiar route I always took. I knew every street corner, every flickering lamppost, every cracked sidewalk tile, or at least, I thought I did. It started subtly, almost innocuously. I passed a small storefront I didn't remember being there before. The building was narrow, sandwiched tightly between two older brick shops, its windows dark and fogged from the rain. A faded sign above the door read something like Mercer's Curiosities, though the letters were barely legible. I slowed down, my curiosity tinged with an uneasy feeling I couldn't place. I had walked this route countless times, yet this store seemed to have appeared overnight. A cold draft seeped out from the doorway, brushing my face, and I shook my head, telling myself I must be imagining it. I walked past it quickly, trying not to think about it, but when I reached the next block, my mind kept turning back. Something about the building felt wrong, off in a way I couldn't name. Its windows reflected the street like a mirror, but in that reflection, I could swear I saw movement, though no one was standing behind me. The rain continued to fall, relentless, masking the faint sound of what almost seemed like whispers, soft to catch words, yet chilling enough to make my stomach not I turned my gaze forward and forced myself to continue. A few minutes later, I passed the same corner again this time. I noticed the store from a slightly different angle. My heart began to beat faster, an uncomfortable rhythm in my chest. It should not have been there again. I had just passed it moments ago, and yet there it was, with the same dark windows, the same crooked sign. My rational mind flailed for explanations. Perhaps I had somehow looped around without realizing it, though the street layout was familiar and straightforward. I walked past slowly, keeping my eyes on the other side of the road, avoiding the store entirely, yet a small, insistent part of me couldn't look away. By the third pass, I could no longer ignore the creeping unease. The store seemed to shift slightly in its appearance one moment. The sign was faded and leaning. The next, it was almost pristine, as though it had been newly painted. The air around it felt heavier, colder, and the rain didn't seem to touch the steps in front of its door. I thought I might be hallucinating. I shook my head, trying to dispel the sense of wrongness pressing against me, but every instinct screamed at me that this was no ordinary building. I passed it a fourth time, and then again, a fifth. Each encounter was subtly different. The window displayed new objects, strange trinkets I could not identify, shapes that looked like they belonged to no earthly origin. Sometimes, I thought I saw faces pressed against the glass, fleeting and indistinct, vanishing the instant I blinked. My mind raced, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a pop-up shop, someone renovating an old storefront, but the details were always wrong. Nothing fit. The architecture didn't match the surrounding buildings. The door handle was ornate, yet the bricks were rough and cracked. The sign swung slightly in the rain, though there was no wind. That night, I returned home, but could not shake the store from my thoughts. The shadows in my apartment seemed to grow longer as I moved through them. Every reflective surface, a window, a mirror, the screen of my laptops, seemed to hold a faint outline of the store, always just at the edge of my vision. Sleep did not come easily, and when it finally did, it was fragmented, full of corridors that led nowhere, and doors that opened to that same dimly lit shop. I could hear whispers in my dreams, sometimes calling my name, sometimes mocking me in a language I could not understand. The following days, I avoided that street entirely. I walked different routes, took buses, and drove whenever I could, but every route seemed to converge toward the store. Even when I tried to convince myself it had never existed, signs of it appeared. A reflection in a passing taxi window. A flicker of a sign from the corner of my eye as I crossed another street. One rainy evening, curiosity overpowered my fear. I approached the store directly, careful and deliberate. The sign read clearly now, Mercer's Curiosities, and the windows were dark again. I reached out to touch the door handle, but it was cold, unnaturally so, and as I leaned closer, the whispers returned. Not soft this time, they were urgent, overlapping, indecipherable but undeniably real. I stepped back, heart racing, and the door opened on its own with a hollow creak, revealing a black interior that seemed to stretch farther than the building should allow. The rain outside fell in sheets, but inside, there was no sound, no humiditized darkness. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet moved forward, almost unwillingly. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of my vision, forming shapes that suggested movement, figures that were only partly human. I felt watched, and yet, the presence seemed friendly and hostile simultaneously, as if it was aware of me in a way I could not comprehend. I don't remember exactly how long I stood there before stepping back into the street. The store was gone the instant I blinked, replaced by a plain brick wall I had seen 100 times before. Tut. The street was ordinary, familiar, safe except for the feeling that I had been seen, noted, remembered. Since that night, I have avoided that street entirely, and yet, the memory lingers. Sometimes, when the rain taps against my window or a shadow moves oddly in a reflection, I think of the store, and I know somehow it is still there, waiting, shifting, watching for me to walk past again. Even now, when I take a new route home, I find myself scanning the streets, half expecting the faint glow of the shop's windows, the crooked sign, the subtle outline of a door that should not exist. I don't know if it follows me, if it exists only in the spaces between moments, or if I am slowly becoming a part of whatever holds it there. All I know is that somewhere in the city, in the endless rain and the soft hum of streetlights, the store waits, and I keep walking, unwillingly, almost drawn, past the same corner, over and over, questioning my mind and my memory, wondering when I will finally see it for what it truly is. I had been walking home late one night, the streets slick with rain, the city lights blurred by the water on the asphalt. My coat was soaked, clinging to me, and I could hear nothing but the soft patter of raindrops and my own footsteps echoing in the quiet streets. It was the kind of night that made everything feel larger, darker, slower, like time itself had thickened, and the world had folded in on itself. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my walking, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine, telling myself it was just the cold, nothing more. At first, I thought it was my imagination. A shadow flitting just beyond the edge of the streetlight. A movement I caught in the corner of my eye. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a passerby, someone else making their way through the rain, but the street behind me was empty. I told myself I must be imagining things. The shadows in the city are always strange at night. But then I began noticing something more deliberate. Every time I adjusted my pace slightly faster to get out of the rain, slightly slower to navigate a puddle, the shadow behind me mirrored it exactly. Not randomly, not loosely, but with precision. It matched my steps perfectly. My heart started to race, but when I dared to glance back fully, I saw nothing. No one. The street was empty, wet reflections of neon signs shimmering in puddles, the occasional stray piece of trash swirling in the rain. Still, I felt it, watching, matching me. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was imagining a phantom, a trick of light and shadow. Yet the sensation grew more pronounced with every block. I could feel a presence in step with me, just beyond perception, always keeping pace without a sound, without a footprint in the wet concrete. The instinct to run battled with curiosity, but my feet moved on, almost hypnotically, as if compelled to keep walking, to maintain the rhythm that someone or something was mirroring. The longer I walked, the more subtle the signals became. A flicker of movement in a darkened doorway, the glint of something reflecting the streetlights for just a second. The rain had softened into a quiet drizzle now, but still the air felt heavy, almost charged, as though something unseen hovered close enough to breathe in tandem with me. I would pause, turn abruptly, and still nothing. Yet when I resumed walking, the feeling persisted. It was always there, just behind me, just beyond my sight. By the time I reached a quieter street, the unease had settled into a deep, hollow dread. My mind struggled to rationalize what my senses insisted was happening. Could it be someone stalking me? A prank? A trick of my own exhaustion? None of it fit. There was no sound, no evidence, no misstep. Only the persistent certainty that I was not alone, that whatever followed was synchronized to my very steps. I could almost feel its awareness of me, a presence attuned to every shift in my balance, every hesitation. I tried to speed up, testing if it would falter. My heartbeat thumped in my ears as my legs pumped harder, my coat flapping in the wind. And yet, the sensation didn't waver. It moved with me, perfectly aligned, perfectly silent. I dared not look back now, not fully. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer. Every dark doorway seemed to invite an impossible depth. My city, familiar and comforting during the day, had transformed into a labyrinth designed to trap me in movement, to keep me aware, always, of the unseen companion pacing me. Hours or perhaps minutes. Time had begun to blur past in this tension. I finally reached the area near my apartment, where familiar buildings should have offered reassurance. But even here, the feeling didn't relent. As I unlocked my door, every instinct screamed at me to glance back once, just once. But I resisted. Stepping inside, I shut the door, the rain muffling the world beyond. And yet, as I leaned against the frame, I could still sense it, still feel the measured, silent pace of the presence that had followed me from empty streets to my doorstep. That night, I could not sleep. Every time my eyelids closed, I felt it. At the edge of my vision, a perfect shadow moving in harmony with my breath, with my heartbeat, with the faint stirrings of consciousness. I realized then that it didn't need to appear to be there. Its presence alone, synchronized and patient, was enough. Hours passed, or maybe years, and the rain outside continued, steady, relentless, as though marking the passage of something infinite. Canes. In the days that followed, I noticed small things. When I walked alone, the feeling of being mirrored never fully left me. When I paused, the world seemed to pause too. And when I stepped forward, it followed, step for step, unbroken, imperceptibly, unyielding. I cannot tell you what it is, or what it wants. I only know that it keeps pace, always, silently, in a rhythm I cannot escape, and that when I walk, I am never truly alone. I had been walking down the quiet street later than usual, the night thick with fog and the lingering smell of rain-soaked asphalt. The streetlights cast weak halos through the mist, painting the world in shades of pale yellow and gray. Each step I took echoed softly, swallowed almost immediately by the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. My eyes flicked to the nearest lamp, its glow wavering, the light flickering like a hesitant heartbeat. I felt a subtle unease, the kind that makes your skin prickle, and I kept moving, telling myself it was nothing but an old bulb struggling against the weather. As I passed under the next lamp, it began its peculiar dance again, flickering in a slow, almost deliberate rhythm. I quickened my pace, yet the moment I walked beneath it, the flickering became more erratic, as if the light itself were aware of my presence. Coat. I tried to ignore it, but the sensation grew stronger, a quiet tension threading through my chest, pressing at my thoughts. The night air was heavy, the mist curling around me like fingers, and I realized I was beginning to notice subtle details I had never seen before: the faint whisper of wind, a shadow moving where no shadow should be. Then, almost instinctively, I stopped. I froze under the nearest flickering streetlight, my breath shallow, ears straining. The moment my feet ceased their movement, the light above me stuttered violently, oscillating between darkness and glow. My heart thumped in time with its rhythm, a slow, uneasy syncopation that felt almost intentional. Around me, the night seemed to lean closer, every distant sound magnified: the tap of water from the gutters, the rustle of unseen leaves, a faint, indistinct whisper I could not place. I wanted to move, to break the connection, but my legs felt weighted, anchored by something I could not see. The flickering became faster, almost trembling, and I sensed a presence in the space around me, not corporeal, yet unmistakably there. It was patient, silent, waiting, and I became aware of a subtle shift in the shadows nearby, a hesitation in the darkness that mirrored my own stillness. I did not know how long I stood there: seconds, minutes, perhaps hours, but the streetlights pulse seemed to stretch time itself. Gradually, I noticed the edges of the street, the familiar lines of pavement and curbs, seemed to bend. Subtle distortions in perspective that made the world feel less solid. Every blink of the flickering light revealed something slightly different. Small movements at the periphery, a shadow that shouldn't be there, a shape that paused and moved just beyond recognition. I realized, with a shiver, that the streetlight was not random in its flicker. It was responding, somehow, to my presence, to my hesitation. When I finally dared to step forward, the light stabilized, glowing steadily as if nothing had happened. But the moment I took another step, I felt it. Again, that invisible attention, the quiet rush of awareness that traced my movements. The street seemed emptier, yet heavier, as if the night itself held its breath, observing, tracking, keeping pace with me. My feet carried me onward automatically, guided by both fear and curiosity, every lamp along the route flickering briefly. As I passed beneath, each one a silent signal that I was being watched, that the rhythm of my motion mattered. Corner. By the time I reached the corner where my apartment building should have offered a sense of safety, the night had thickened into something almost tactile, a palpable atmosphere of patient scrutiny. Even indoors, the memory lingered, every light that flickered, every shadow that trembled at the edge of vision, every quiet, imperceptible movement seemed tied to that first streetlight, the one under which I had paused and found myself measured by something unseen. I could not sleep that night, nor the nights after, because every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the flicker returning, a slow, deliberate pulse, as if the light were waiting for me to stop again. I cannot explain what I saw, or what felt formless yet deliberate in the night, and perhaps I do not want to. The streetlight will always linger in my memory, a rhythm that haunts my steps, a reminder that when I move through the world, unseen, eyes may be tracking, waiting, flickering in time with my every motion. And I know, if I ever stop again under a lone light in the dark, the world will hold its breath, and whatever waits will notice. I never thought a simple walk home from work could feel so unsettling. But that night changed something in me, something I can't quite put into words. The rain was constant, a soft, unrelenting patter against the pavement, the kind that presses, clear against your skin and seeps into your clothes no matter how tightly you wrap yourself. I had left the office late, the streets nearly empty, and the neon lights of the city blurred through the drizzle like fragile, trembling ghosts. The air was damp and smelled faintly of wet asphalt and metal, a mixture that had always comforted me, until that night. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. The rhythm of my footsteps was hypnotic, matching the soft, endless rain. The city seemed quieter than usual, almost as though it had held its breath, waiting. I passed closed shops and darkened windows, the displays dimly lit by the faint glow of flickering neon signs. I always liked walking by these storefronts. They offered a kind of quiet reflection, a pause from the chaos of the streets. That evening, one window in particular caught my attention. It was a small boutique, its interior dark except for a faint, amber light that seemed to come from nowhere. I stopped, instinctively, drawn in by the reflection in the glass. At first glance, I saw myself, or at least, I thought I did. My own tired face stared back at me, pale and wet from the rain. But then, as I adjusted my gaze, a flicker of wrongness tugged at the edges of my perception. The reflection moved in ways I didn't. A subtle tilt of the head, a blink slightly delayed, a faint unplaceable smirk that I had never worn. Tie froze, heart skipping. I tried to convince myself it was just the rain, or the dim lighting, maybe a trick of the glass. Yet, as I leaned closer, I noticed more. The reflection's eyes were darker, almost too still, but focused directly on me, not the me standing in the street, but through me, almost as if it was seeing parts of me I didn't even know existed. I recoiled slightly, shivering despite the thick jacket I wore. The street felt colder, the rain heavier, and the faint echo of my own breathing seemed off, slower than my actual pulse. I stepped back and kept walking, telling myself it was just a reflection, just exhaustion playing tricks. But the feeling didn't leave. Every storefront I passed afterward seemed to watch me, the rain-streaked windows occasionally hinting at figures that weren't there. Shadows that moved just a little too fluidly, shapes that seemed to linger even when I turned my head. I began to notice a pattern. Every reflective surface showed a version of me that didn't quite belong. In a car window, I saw my reflection smiling faintly when I was frowning. In a polished brass sign, my eyes were wide and empty, staring somewhere beyond the city. I tried to speed up, the rhythmic splatter of rain now a drumbeat against my anxiety. Cue. Yet, despite my haste, I kept seeing glimpses of that wrong self. In puddles at my feet, in the glass doors of closed cafes, even in the wet windshields of parked cars. There it was, following, mirroring, but never quite matching. And sometimes, when I thought I had lost it, I would hear it. Not words, exactly. More like a soft murmur, a sigh that blended with the rain but carried a familiarity that made my stomach twist. A whisper of me, yet not mine, as if it existed somewhere just beyond my perception. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was shaking. My hands were slick with rain, my hair plastered to my face, and my chest felt tight. I told myself it would all be fine once I was inside, away, streets, away from the glass that reflected impossibilities. I fumbled with my keys, trying to steady my breathing, and then I saw it again. Through the glass of the lobby door, my reflection waited, but this time, it wasn't mimicking me. It was standing perfectly still, expressionless, watching. I blinked, and it tilted its head. I jerked my eyes away, heart racing. The moment I looked back, it was gone, or at least it seemed to be. I told myself it was the light playing tricks, my mind scrambling to reconcile what my tired eyes had seen. Inside, I locked the door behind me and sank against it, shaking. I tried to occupy myself with mundane tasks, anything to anchor me in. Reality, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the tick of a wall clock, the warm light spilling from my bedside lamp. But the images clung to my mind. Each reflective surface in my apartment became a potential window for that other self. I avoided mirrors, covered the windows. And yet, even in the corners of my vision, I felt it. Present, waiting, watching. Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, and felt the weight of something unseen pressing against the edges of the room. Shadows seemed to gather and stretch toward me, subtle, undulating forms that left me holding my breath. Occasionally, I would hear the faintest scrape or sigh, a sound that could have been the rain, or could have been something else entirely. I told myself that if I closed my eyes and didn't look, it would pass. But the moment I drifted toward sleep, a flicker of movement at the corner of my vision would jerk me awake. Always that sense of wrongness, that feeling that somewhere, someone or something was mimicking me, just out of reach. Days passed, though I cannot be sure how many. The rain never truly ceased, and the streets seemed perpetually glistening, as though the city had been caught in a moment of eternal wetness. I ventured outside only when necessary, and always at night, my eyes fixed on the asphalt, avoiding reflections wherever possible. And yet, every time I glimpsed myself in a shop window, in the dark glass of a passing car, or in the mirror of a public restroom, there it was again. My reflection, not mine, staring, waiting, and somehow knowing me in ways I couldn't comprehend. I tried to tell someone, anyone, but the words felt hollow. How do you explain a reflection that isn't you? People nod, give sympathetic smiles, or assume stress, exhaustion, anxiety. And perhaps that is what it is. Stress, exhaustion, anxiety, but something deep in my chest knows it isn't. There is a weight behind it, a consciousness that is not my own, and it lingers in the spaces where light meets glass, where water meets pavement. Even now, as I recount this, the rain has returned, tapping against the window like soft fingers. Code. I see myself in the reflection of the darkened screen of my laptop, and I hesitate. My reflection blinks, but I have not. A chill runs down my spine, but I cannot look away. It watches me, patiently, knowing that every word I write, every thought I have, is somehow already understood by that other self. I do not know if it will ever leave. Perhaps it never intends to. Perhaps it exists in the spaces between reality and perception. In the quiet moments when the world is too still, too wet, too reflective. I sometimes imagine it waiting for the perfect moment to step out, to inhabit the world as I do, and I wonder if the day comes when it will no longer be confined to glass and water, if it will finally be free to move as I move, to breathe as I breathe, to speak as I speak. So, I warn you, should you find yourself wandering streets under a rain-soaked night, pause before gazing into the windows. Watch your reflection, yes, but look closely. Look for the subtle tilt of the head, the faint, unplaceable smirk. Listen for the sighs that blend too easily with the rain. And remember that sometimes the person staring back at you may not be you at all. Even now, when I shut my eyes to sleep, I feel it beside me in the dark, always there, watching, patient, knowing, and I am never quite alone. I remember that evening clearly, even though I wish I didn't. The sky was heavy with clouds, low and dark, pressing down on the streets as the rain began its steady, soothing fall, the kind of rain that makes the city smell sharp and metallic, that glistens on asphalt and sidewalks, and softens the edges of everything. I had been walking home from work, my coat pulled tightly around me, hood up, listening to the rhythmic drumming of rain against my shoulders. The city felt unusually empty that night. Streetlights reflected off wet roads, flickering faintly, as if the universe itself were unsure whether to keep them on. I reached the intersection near the corner shop I sometimes stopped at for tea. Normally, this junction was bustling, cars waiting, pedestrians crossing, the world alive with motion. But that night, it was quiet, almost eerily so. I waited at curb, my gaze flicking between the red traffic light above and the blurred reflections in the rain-slicked pavement. The rain made everything look slightly unreal, stretched and distorted, like a painting left to smear in water. Then I saw her. She stepped out onto the street before the lights had turned green. At first, I thought she was just reckless or distracted, a momentary lapse in judgment. But there was something strange about the way she moved, deliberate yet impossibly fluid, as if gravity were a suggestion she chose to ignore. Her coat clung to her like wet silk, dark hair plastered against her face. I didn't know her, had never seen her before, but something about her presence made the hairs on my arms stand up. I stepped forward instinctively, drawn to the absurdity of her action, the wrongness in the timing of it all. She took 3 steps, maybe 4, into the street. The puddles rippled around her feet, each splash echoing softly against the empty buildings. And then before I could blink, before the sound of the approaching car reached me, she was gone, vanished. I froze, my mind struggling to form sense from nonsense. The rain continued to fall, the streetlights still flickering. The pavement was wet and reflective, yet she left no mark, no ripple, no trace of disturbance beyond the memory of the puddles her feet had touched. I called her name softly, hesitant at first, then louder, as though sound could tether her back to reality. But there was no answer, just the rain, falling rhythmically, endlessly. For a moment, I considered that it was my imagination. Perhaps a trick of the light, a reflection bending in the rain. But the terror that gripped my chest refused such simple explanations. I had seen her. I had watched her step into the street, and then, in that blink, she ceased to exist. I retraced my steps slowly, scanning the sidewalks, the puddles, the empty street. Nothing moved except the rain. Nothing breathed except me. The city was silent, the usual hum of distant traffic muted, as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath. I asked anyone passing by, a solitary figure huddled under an umbrella, if they had seen anyone. They looked at me oddly, shaking their heads. No one had crossed that street. No one had stepped out before the lights changed. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her walking, her figure dissolving into mist as if swallowed by the rain. I dreamt of crossing streets, of lights that never changed, of shadows that moved against their own logic. Sometimes I would wake to find the faintest echo of footsteps outside my window, soft, deliberate, the pace of someone walking, yet no one was there. Days passed, and I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, a fleeting encounter made monstrous by exhaustion and the relentless rain. But then I began to notice other things. Shadows at the corner of my eyes, vanishing whenever I looked directly. Reflections in wet pavement, not quite matching my own movements. The feeling of being observed, always, even in the safety of my apartment. And sometimes, if I walked at night, I would catch glimpses of her again, stepping into the street before the light changed, only to vanish before my mind could fully process it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I could predict it. The places she would appear, the exact moment she would step forward, the faint ripple of the puddles beneath her feet. And yet, I could never reach her. She remained untouchable, a presence that existed just beyond the boundary of reality. I started keeping track, in small notes on my phone, of the streets she appeared on. Each observation was unsettlingly precise. A park path, an empty crosswalk, a side street slick with rain, and each time the same thing happened. She stepped forward before the light, and then disappeared, leaving nothing behind. No footprints, no disturbance, no explanation. I even tried to follow her once. I left work early, waited at the intersection I knew she would appear. The rain fell heavier that evening, blurring the edges of the city, and when she stepped into the street, I ran, calling her name, moving as fast as I could. But as my fingers stretched out toward her, she dissolved, like mist under a lamp, leaving only the steady rhythm of rain around me. My chest heaved, soaked through, and I felt a nausea that was half fear, half disbelief. I stopped telling anyone about her. People stopped asking, and my own sense of rationality began to fray. I couldn't reconcile the logic of disappearance with the certainty of what I had seen. I began avoiding crosswalks at night, avoiding streets I knew were empty, avoiding reflections in puddles. Yet, no matter how careful I was, the sensation never left me, the awareness of something moving in the gaps of reality, in the spaces between the rain and the streetlight. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain falls softly against my window, I imagine her stepping out into the street. The lights remain red, the city still. She steps forward before time allows, and then vanishes. I wonder where she goes, or what she is waiting for. And sometimes, in my most honest moments, I wonder if she's waiting for me, just as I've been waiting for her for all this time. I don't walk alone at night anymore. I don't cross streets, I don't have to. And yet, I feel her, just beyond perception, in every shadow, in every puddle, in every silence broken only by the steady, gentle sound of rain. And I know that one day, perhaps, the lights will change, and I might not see her step into the street, but I will be the one who disappears. Even now, as I speak, I feel the memory of that night pressing against my mind. The city hums with life beyond my walls, but in the quiet moments when rain falls, I remember her, stepping forward before the light changes, and vanishing. And I know that somewhere out there, in the spaces where the world bends, she is still waiting, and so am I. I had always found comfort in the routine of my evening commute. The city streets glistened after rain, the smell of wet asphalt and metal lingering in the air. My car wipers cut through the drizzle rhythmically, a steady pulse against the quiet hum of traffic. That night, I was driving home later than usual, tired from the day's work, but content. The streets seemed emptier than normal, the neon lights reflecting off puddles with an almost dreamlike quality. There was a calm in the rain, a lull that made the world feel suspended, as though time itself were slowing. As I approached the intersection near the overpass, I noticed something strange. The traffic ahead had stopped entirely. Cars were lined up, their brake lights glowing red in the rain. But what unsettled me was that no one was moving. No headlights flickered, no figures exited vehicles, nothing stirred in the wet air. It was still eerily so. I slowed to a stop, assuming perhaps an accident or police blockade. Yet, as I glanced around, I saw no flashing lights, no people, nothing to explain the sudden halt. Then I noticed the engines. Every single car around me was running. The low hum of idling engines filled the rain-slicked street like a chorus of quiet tension. The sound was uniform, endless, unnatural in its perfection. Normally, engines would sputter, cough, or be turned off when people stepped out. But here, the hum remained constant, smooth, almost deliberate. It pressed against me, low in my chest, like a warning. I looked forward again and saw the windshield of the car directly in front of me. There was someone or something behind the wheel, but as my eyes focused, the figure became wrong. It was sitting there perfectly still, its hands frozen on the steering wheel, the posture rigid and unnatural. And yet, the engine continued to hum. I blinked, thinking it was my imagination. Perhaps the reflection of a streetlight had tricked my eyes. But then I looked to my left and right. Every car was the same. Every engine running. Every driver still. Like mannequins in the rain. A chill ran down my spine. Cue dodge. I wanted to reverse, to retreat, but my car seemed heavier, as though the air itself resisted motion. The rain continued to fall softly, each drop echoing on the hood, each splash a subtle punctuation to the growing unease. I tried to reason with myself. Perhaps it was a traffic jam. Perhaps a power outage had frozen the signals. Perhaps people had abandoned their vehicles momentarily. Rational explanations flickered in my mind, but they didn't soothe me. Stillness of the drivers, the perfection of the engine hums, the complete absence of human motion, it all felt wrong. I honked my horn, short bursts, then longer. Nothing. The sound seemed swallowed by the thick rain, or perhaps by the weight of the stillness. I tried rolling down my window to call out, but the rain poured in, soaking my sleeve instantly. I shouted, and my own voice felt alien, echoed oddly in the empty, humid air. Still, no one responded. The engines hummed. The rain fell, and I began to feel an awful, creeping sense that I was utterly alone. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally. I checked my watch, then the dashboard clock. Minutes passed like hours. The rain didn't change. The light didn't flicker. The engines didn't falter. And yet, I felt watched, dead. I didn't dare look behind me, but I knew something was there, lingering, hiding in the reflections of wet surfaces, in the dark spaces between vehicles. The sensation was quiet, patient, like a predator that didn't need to move to terrify. I considered leaving my car. I almost stepped out, pressing my palm to the hood, listening to the consistent hum. But something stopped me. I couldn't explain it. A voice in my head, calm but insistent, whispered that to leave was to invite attention, that stepping into the rain might expose me to something beyond comprehension. So I stayed, trapped in the driver's seat, feeling the engines around me pulse as one with my own racing heartbeat. As I stared through the windshield, the headlights of the vehicles around me seemed to flicker not with the usual electrical imperfection, but in a pattern, deliberate, almost communicative. I squinted and realized the light pulsed in sync with my own pulse. My chest tightened, and I felt nausea rise in my stomach. Something about the rhythm of it, the synchronized engines, the still figures, felt like a message I was not supposed to understand. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed. The rain never stopped. I didn't move. My eyes scanned every reflection, every glistening puddle, every chrome bumper. And then I saw it, or perhaps it saw me, in the rearview mirror, A faint shimmer passed. Across the street behind me, a shadow, a person. I couldn't tell. When I turned to look directly, nothing was there. But the sensation remained. Something had passed, just beyond perception. Close enough to make me shiver, far enough to remain untouchable. I tried to start the car, press the accelerator, anything to move. But the engine refused. It hummed, but the pedals were dead. I felt my hands tremble on the wheel, the rain now soaking through my coat, but still, I couldn't move. And yet, the engines around me continued their perfect, synchronized hum, a chorus of life where no life existed. Eventually, the traffic signal changed, red to green. My legs obeyed the pedals reflexively, the car lurching forward, but nothing else did. The cars ahead of me remained still, engines humming, figures frozen. I drove past them slowly, every sense alert, every nerve screaming. And when I glanced to the side, for just a second, I saw it in the reflection of the wet pavement, a crowd of figures standing just beyond the street, still, silent, watching me move through their frozen world. I didn't stop driving that night. I didn't look back. When I finally reached my street, when I finally turned into my driveway, the feeling didn't leave me. I parked, shut off the engine, and sat for a long time in the dark, listening to my own breathing, to the rain still falling outside, trying to convince myself that what I saw was impossible. Yet I could feel it in the spaces around me, the echo of countless engines running where no one existed, the presence of still, rigid figures waiting somewhere beyond perception. I haven't taken that route since. I avoid intersections, avoid the late-night commute, avoid reflections in puddles, avoid thinking about it at all. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain falls softly against my window and the hum of distant traffic reaches my ears, I feel the memory stir. And I know, without doubt, that somewhere, in the spaces between red lights and green, in the stillness of running engines, it waits. And it will wait patiently for anyone foolish enough to pass through. Even now, as I tell this story, I imagine that night continuing somewhere, in some other city, on some other street. The engines running, the figures frozen, the rain falling, and I know, if I ever step into the wrong intersection again, I might be the one frozen, engine running, waiting, silently, in the rain. I remember walking down that street like it was yesterday, even though I've tried hard to forget. The evening was cool, the air thick with the scent of rain that had fallen earlier, leaving slick patches along the sidewalk. Street lamps glimmered faintly in the puddles, reflecting fractured colors of the city, as if the world were slightly out of focus. I was heading home, after a long day, the kind of day where fatigue makes your muscles heavy and your thoughts sluggish. My coat was damp, my shoes soaked from the rain, and my umbrella, forgotten at my office desk, left me exposed to the soft drizzle that had resumed. The street was busy but subdued. People walked in pairs or small groups, faces hidden beneath hoods and hats, their movements slow, purposeful, yet somehow distant. I noticed the cafe ahead, its warm lights spilling onto the wet pavement, casting a golden glow that shimmered in the puddles. Inside, people were gathered, drinking, laughing, moving about, as one expects, in a cozy cafe, on a rainy evening. I could see their faces through the wide front window, framed by condensation that blurred their features slightly, giving everything an unreal, impressionistic quality. As I drew closer, something shifted. My steps slowed without conscious thought, my pulse ticking a little faster. I noticed that the people inside were all staring in the same direction. Not at their drinks, not at a street performer, not at each other, no. They were staring directly at the cafe door. It wasn't the usual casual glance you get when someone notices someone entering. It was precise, unwavering, a collective gaze that seemed impossible in its synchronization. I paused, midway across the sidewalk, staring into the window, feeling a chill creep down my spine. Their eyes were wide, fixed, unblinking, and yet their mouths moved softly, almost imperceptibly, like whispers shared among themselves. I couldn't make out words, but the motion suggested conversation, a low hum beneath the rain's ambient sound. Pret. It was as if they were speaking, but speaking without speaking, communicating some secret that I wasn't meant to hear. I shifted my gaze to the door itself, expecting to see some obvious reason for their attention. Perhaps a stray animal had wandered in, perhaps a street performer was outside, perhaps an odd decoration caught the light in a strange way. But the door was ordinary, mundane, just a simple wooden door with brass handles, warm lights spilling around its edges. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that warranted such focused attention. Unease settled deep in my chest. I considered turning away, hurrying past, but curiosity had a strange grip that night. I continued walking slowly, each step deliberate, the echo of my shoes muted by the wet pavement. The people didn't blink, didn't move their gaze. They remained fixed on the door as I passed. I felt their eyes brush against my back, not in a casual way, but as if measuring, calculating, waiting for something. As I reached the midpoint of the cafe's window, I caught movement at the edges of my vision. A shadow flickered behind the door, subtle but deliberate. Not enough to reveal itself fully, not enough to understand, but just enough to make my skin crawl. I swallowed hard, a dry, tense sensation in my throat, and quickened my pace, glancing sideways at the cafe again. They hadn't moved. Their eyes still followed, their attention fixed unwaveringly on the door, as though some invisible tether pulled their gaze. I passed the door, my steps faster now, heart hammering in my chest. A soft, metallic creak resonated from the hinges as if the door had moved slightly, though I hadn't touched it. I didn't dare look back at first, my instincts screaming to keep my eyes on the street ahead, to ignore what I couldn't explain. But eventually, I couldn't resist. Through the rain-streaked glass, I saw it. Or perhaps, I saw them. Just for a second, a silhouette, taller than any person, darker than the shadows around it, standing just behind the door, as if it were waiting, and then it vanished. Not through movement, not slipping out of the door, just gone, erased from sight. In a way that made my stomach turn. The cafe's patrons didn't react, they didn't blink, didn't move. Their collective gaze remained locked, unbroken, as though the silhouette was always there, always present, just outside the boundaries of perception. I continued down the street, my pace uneven, glancing over my shoulder from time to time, each reflection in the rain-slicked pavement seemed to distort, elongate, or echo the shape of that door, or perhaps the shadow I had glimpsed. Street lamps flickered, neon signs buzzed faintly, the city noises dimmed in my awareness. I felt watched, followed, though I saw no one. The presence lingered, subtle, like a pressure in the air, in the spaces between the droplets of rain. When stewed, I finally reached the next corner. I glanced back again. The cafe had returned to normal. Warm light spilling, patrons moving naturally, faces no longer fixed. Laughter and conversation resumed, as though nothing had happened. I couldn't tell if I had imagined it, if exhaustion and the rainy haze had distorted reality, but the memory burned itself into me. Something about that door, about the gaze, had been too precise, too intentional, to be dismissed as a trick of the mind. In the following days, I avoided that street. Yet, whenever I walked past other cafes, restaurants, or shops, I felt the same sense of attention, the same weight of unblinking eyes, as though somewhere, always, people lore something were waiting, staring, focused on a point I couldn't understand. And sometimes, when I closed my eyes at night, I saw that door again, dark and silent, a shadow lingering just behind it, and the crowd watching patiently, waiting for something I didn't want to know. Even now, months later, I pass that street, in memory, hearing the faint murmur of whispers and the tapping of rain against glass. And I wonder, sometimes with a shiver that runs to my toes, what they were watching for, and whether I had brushed too close to the edge of whatever they were, waiting to reveal. The door remains in my mind, the crowd remains in my mind, and I know that somewhere, if I ever return, I might find that gaze waiting for me again, unwavering, unblinking, and I might not be able to walk past it all. I had always hated commuting at night, but that evening I had no choice. The office had run late, and the train schedule left me with a long walk through the half-empty streets to reach the subway. Rain had begun to fall again, soft and persistent, turning the pavement into dark, reflective mirrors. Streetlights shimmered in puddles, stretching into long, trembling lines that flickered as I passed. My coat was damp, my shoes squelching with each step, but I kept moving, eager to escape the chill and the sense of unease that seemed to settle over the city after sunset. The entrance to the subway was quiet, almost unnaturally so. A few late-night commuters trickled in and out, their umbrellas folding with wet clicks, their footsteps echoing off the tiled walls. I descended the stairs slowly, the smell of wet concrete and faint metal rising around me. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering now and then, adding to the strange, uneasy rhythm of the station. That's when I noticed her. She was standing at the top of the stairs, under the dull yellow light of the street lamp, waiting. Her coat was dark, blending almost seamlessly with the shadows, and her hair was damp, clinging to her face. I didn't recognize her. I hadn't seen her before. There was nothing overtly threatening about her, yet I felt an immediate, inexplicable tension tighten in my chest. She wasn't moving forward, wasn't boarding any train, just standing there, watching me as I descended. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the isolation of the late-night streets had warped my perception. But as I continued down the stairs, I caught a movement from the corner of my eye. She had followed me, not briskly, not hurriedly, but with the same deliberate, silent pace. Every step I took seemed to be mirrored in the faint echoes behind me, though when I glanced back, she remained a few meters away, always observing, always present. The subway platform stretched before me, dimly lit and damp, the scent of wet stone and faint rust pervasive. Few people waited for the late train, most sitting silently on cold metal benches, heads down, eyes fixed on nothing. I stepped onto the platform, checking the timetable. The next train wouldn't arrive for several minutes, but she appeared. Beside the stairwell, not boarding, not interacting with anyone, simply standing. My skin prickled. I felt a cold pressure in the air, a sensation of being watched from multiple directions at once. I moved closer to the edge of the platform, as if the slight distance would offer safety. The tiles beneath my shoes were slick, reflecting the overhead lights in distorted, trembling patterns. And still, she didn't move. She didn't enter. The train didn't descend the steps further, didn't speak to anyone. She simply remained, her gaze following me. I tried to focus on other people, on the advertisements plastered along the walls, the flickering signs above the tracks, anything to distract myself. But her presence was persistent, insistent, impossible to ignore. The hum of the subway tunnel began, distant at first, then growing, vibrating through the walls and floors, mixing with the soft patter of rain outside. The few commuters around me stirred, shifting weight, glancing down the tracks, but none seemed to notice her. Only I saw her. Only I felt the weight of her silent observation pressing against my chest. My breaths became shallow, cautious. I didn't dare move closer, but I also didn't dare leave. The train arrived, sliding into the station with a rush of wind and the sharp squeal of brakes. Doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, warm light spilling onto the cold platform. People boarded, jostling slightly, finding seats, settling in, and she remained at the stairwell, just beyond the reach of the platform lights, untouched by the brightness, untouched by the movement. She didn't step forward, didn't board, didn't acknowledge the train at all. She simply watched. I stepped aboard, my heart pounding, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the overhead rail. I dared one glance back through the window. She was still there, standing motionless in the flickering light, unyielding, observing. A shiver ran through me. I told myself it was a coincidence, that perhaps someone was waiting for someone else, that the late-night hours had turned a simple observer into something monstrous in my mind. But even as I tried to reason, I couldn't shake the sense that she had chosen me specifically, that my presence had drawn her attention, and that attention carried weight far beyond mere curiosity. The train lurched forward, the hum of the tracks vibrating through the carriage, the rhythmic clatter a temporary relief from the oppressive awareness of her gaze. I avoided looking at the windows beside me, afraid of glimpsing her reflection or some impossible shadow. The few other passengers remained quiet, absorbed in their own worlds. Yet I could feel it, the memory of her standing at the platform, fixed and unmoving, imprinted onto my mind like a photograph I could not erase. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The train moved through dark tunnels, the lights flickering intermittently. Every shadow in the carriage seemed to twist slightly, as if aware of my anxiety. I tried to focus on the advertisements, on the scrolling map above the doors, anything to convince myself that I was safe, that I had left her behind. But the sensation lingered, like a soft pressure against my shoulder, a whisper at the edge of perception that I couldn't quite place. By the time I reached my stop, my legs felt weak, my chest tight, my mind tense. I stepped off the train quickly, forcing myself to walk briskly through the nearly empty station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, trembling shadows. I glanced back once more as I exited to the street above. The platform was empty now, the stairwell dark and silent. She was gone. But the feeling didn't leave me. The knowledge that she could still be there, waiting at some other station, following someone else, or maybe following me again, settled deep in my gut. I never saw her again in the subway, but I began noticing shadows where there shouldn't be shadows, reflections in store windows that seemed slightly off, the feeling of being observed from the corners of my vision. Every late commute left me tense. My pulse quickened at stairwells, at escalators, at the faint sound of footsteps behind me that didn't belong, and I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that she had never intended to board the train. She was never part of the normal world. She existed just outside it, waiting, watching, patient. Even now, if I find myself at a subway station late at night, I feel her presence lingering in the periphery. The memory of her gaze, the impossibility of her stillness, and the quiet, unyielding patience of someone or something waiting silently. Just beyond my reach haunts me still, and I know, somewhere, in some shadowed stairwell, she continues to follow, never boarding, never moving, always watching. I walked home later than usual that night, the city quiet and dimly lit, the kind of silence that felt heavy and watching. My footsteps echoed faintly on the pavement, the dull thud of shoes on concrete mixing with the hum of distant traffic, and the occasional flicker of neon signs from closed shops. I had taken this route countless times before, the street familiar, almost comforting. But that evening, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the sidewalk. It was wet. Dark, glistening patches stretched under the faint glow of the streetlights, reflecting distorted fragments of the buildings and signs around me. I stopped, frowning. I knew it hadn't rained in weeks. The forecast had been dry, and even in city prone to sudden showers, there hadn't been a drop in days. I bent down, half expecting to see some spilled water or a burst pipe, but there was nothing. The concrete shimmered as if coated with dew, but no moisture clung to my hands when I touched it. I shook my head, laughing nervously at my own mind. Cities play tricks on you at night, I told myself. Shadows bend in strange ways, lights flicker, and sometimes your brain insists that ordinary streets are uncanny. I took a step forward, my shoes squeaking softly against the slick surface, and that's when I noticed footprints. Faint, wet impressions trailing along the sidewalk, leading the way ahead, but they weren't mine. I had come alone, and the marks weren't fresh, not from someone walking behind me. Yet they were there, damp and gleaming under the light. I paused, heart thudding, glancing over my shoulder. The street behind me was empty. Shops were closed, windows dark except for a few glowing signs, and no one moved. The footsteps ahead continued in a straight line, precise, deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was someone else, perhaps a late-night cleaner or a passerby, but as I stepped cautiously forward, the wet impressions continued to appear, always just a few feet ahead of me, as if guiding me somewhere I didn't want to go. The streetlights flickered, and in the gaps of illumination, I thought I saw shapes. Shadows that didn't align with the poles or the buildings, darker than the night, stretching oddly along the sidewalk. I quickened my pace, keeping my eyes fixed on the footprints. They were still wet, still gleaming, as though something was always a step ahead, keeping them fresh, keeping them alive. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the scent of wet concrete and something faintly metallic, something that didn't belong. I glanced around, the corners of buildings and doorways suddenly filled with shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The city that had always felt safe, mundane, familiar, now seemed to shift around me, subtly, impossibly. I passed a closed cafe, the windows dark, yet in the reflection I saw movement. Not in the street, not in the glass itself, but a shadow, tall and thin, shifting just behind me in the reflection. I turned quickly, and there was nothing. The street remained empty, the sidewalk wet, the footprints continuing ahead. My pulse raced, and a shiver ran down my spine. I tried to step off the wet sidewalk onto the dry curb, but every time I did, the damp trail continued alongside me, the edges gleaming, undisturbed by my attempts to escape it. It was as if the street itself had absorbed the wetness and was deliberately extending it, guiding me, pressing me forward. I wanted to run, to turn back, but an inexplicable force held me in place. My legs felt heavy, as if the air itself resisted my movement. Then I heard it. A faint, almost inaudible sound of footsteps, not echoing my own, but matching the pace of the wet prints. Slow, deliberate, measured. I froze. The street behind me remained empty, yet the sound persisted, coming from the direction of the footprints ahead. I tried to call out, my voice trembling, but it caught in my throat, leaving only a dry whisper that the wind carried away. I continued walking, every instinct screaming to escape, but my curiosity, or perhaps terror, drove me forward. The sidewalk stretched endlessly, the wetness reflecting a night that seemed unnaturally still. Streetlights flickered in patterns that I couldn't track, and the shadows around me twisted subtly, forming shapes just beyond the edges of my vision. I thought I saw a figure at the corner of a shop ahead, something small, hunched, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. Minutes or hours passed. The city seemed suspended in time. Footprints continued ahead, the wetness persistent, unyielding. I passed a row of abandoned shops, their windows coated in grime, yet in each reflection, I saw it. A fleeting figure, too quick to focus on, always just at the edge of perception. I wasn't alone. Something followed. Something I could not confront directly, something that left the sidewalk wet even when there had been no rain. A faint whisper reached me then, almost imperceptible, over the hum of distant traffic and the occasional clatter of a stray object in the wind. It was soft, indistinct, like a voice carried on the edge of hearing. My heart hammered. I strained to listen, The wet footprints ahead seemed to pulse slightly, the glimmering edges growing sharper, more defined. The street itself felt alive, aware of me, aware of my hesitation, my fear. I finally reached my block, familiar streetlights guiding me toward my building. The sidewalk before my door was wet, just like the rest of the street. And then I saw it. One last set of footprints leading straight to my steps, stopping abruptly at my threshold. I wanted to laugh nervously, to shake my head, tell myself it was coincidence. But the air around me was thick with expectation, with the sense that someone or something had been waiting. I closed my door quickly, locking it, leaning against it to steady myself. Inside, the apartment was warm, dry, mundane, yet I could not shake the image of the wet sidewalk, the impossible footprints, the shadows at the edges of my vision. That night, and many nights after, I dreamed of the street. I walked endlessly, wet concrete, stretching ahead, footsteps glistening, shadows curling and twisting, always just out of reach. Weeks later, I avoided that street entirely. I took longer routes, detours through brighter avenues, streets bustling with life. Yet, whenever I closed my eyes, I saw the wet sidewalk, the persistent footprints, the impossible reflections in darkened windows. I felt watched, followed not by a person, but by the very world itself, altered subtly in ways I could not understand. See, the rain, the wetness, the shadows, they were waiting. And I knew, deep down, that if I ever returned, I would find the sidewalk wet again, even if the sky was clear, and the footprints would continue, leading me somewhere I did not want to go. Even now, years later, I cannot walk past wet pavement without a shiver, without remembering that night when the city itself seemed alive, deliberate, and haunting. And I know that somewhere, on some quiet street, the sidewalk waits, the wetness persistent, and the footprints ahead, guiding, watching, patient. I had been walking home later than usual that night, the city unusually quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every small sound unnerving. Streetlights flickered in pale, intermittent pulses, reflecting in the damp patches of the sidewalk. I didn't remember it raining that day, yet the concrete glistened as if the sky itself had leaked silently, but my footsteps echoed softly, unevenly, and I found myself glancing around more often than usual, noting shadows where there shouldn't be shadows, movements at the corners of my eyes that disappeared when I looked directly. I reached a narrow side street I often took as a shortcut. The faint hum of distant traffic faded the further I walked, leaving only the soft whisper of my shoes against the pavement. I paused for a moment, adjusting my coat, and that's when I noticed the street behind me looked wrong. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks. The familiar row of lampposts and shop windows that always lined that block seemed distant, distorted, blurred. I squinted, trying to focus, and then I realized the unthinkable. It was gone, completely gone. Where the street should have been, there was nothing but darkness. Not shadows, not alleys, just an empty, featureless blackness that seemed to stretch endlessly. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe steadily, reminding myself that I had taken this route countless times. Maybe it was an optical illusion, some trick of the light. Maybe I had been staring too long at the reflections in the wet pavement. I stepped backward cautiously, hoping to see the familiar street reappear. But each time I tried to retrace my steps, the darkness only deepened. It pressed closer, heavy and silent, swallowing the faint echoes of the city behind me. I tried to call out, to shout for anyone nearby, but my voice sounded hollow, muffled, as if the air itself refused to carry it. The familiar city noises, the distant horns, the occasional footsteps of other pedestrians were gone too. It was just me, standing at the edge of an impossible void. The air felt thicker here, cooler, damp, with an odor I couldn't place. It smelled faintly metallic, like old rainwater running over rusted metal, but mixed with something sweeter, almost like decay. I forced myself to step forward, toward where the street should have been, expecting some trick of perspective to correct itself. But the more I moved, the more the darkness seemed to shift, forming vague shapes at the edge of my vision. Shapes that weren't there moments ago. Impossible angles that bent the world in ways that made my stomach twist. I reached a faint glow in the distance, the faintest hint of light, and I thought, perhaps, that this was the continuation of the street. Relief surged in me, but it was fragile. The glow didn't brighten as I approached. Instead, the pavement beneath my feet changed. It was smooth, unyielding, and wet, though again I could see no rain. My shoes made no sound as they moved across it, and when I looked down, my reflection wavered, distorted and strange, like the surface of a disturbed pond. I began to walk faster, compelled toward the light, though my legs felt heavy, weighted, tense by something unseen. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, just beyond hearing, a susurration that seemed to curl around my ears and down my spine. I froze, straining to make sense of it. It wasn't words I could understand, but a rhythm, a cadence, something deliberately teasing, patient, alive. The darkness shifted again, and I caught glimpses of figures or reflections moving just at the edges, never fully stepping into view, always receding when I tried to focus. I thought about turning back. Maybe if I retraced my steps carefully, I could reach the normal street again. But each time I glanced over my shoulder, the darkness was absolute, solid, swallowing the familiar world. There were no streetlights, no shop windows, no sidewalks, only the void, silent and unyielding. My heart pounded, my breath shallow, the soft sound of my pulse in my ears as if the world itself were holding its breath. I moved forward again, toward the distant glow. The light didn't clarify, didn't illuminate. Instead, it pulsated softly, a warm, uneasy shimmer that painted the edges of the darkness in muted gold. I walked for what felt like hours, though the distance barely changed. Time seemed warped here. Shadows twisted and stretched along the ground, sometimes elongating toward me, sometimes slithering sideways like living things. Occasionally, I thought I saw a doorway or an arch, but when I focused, it vanished, leaving only more blackness, coat, and the unnerving reflection of myself in the smooth, wet pavement. At some point, I began to notice small, impossible details. The wet surface beneath my feet carried footprints my own, yet distorted. Too long, too narrow, too shallow, as if someone else had stepped through me, tracing my movements before I even made them. I couldn't reconcile it. couldn't rationalize it. I bent to look closer, and my reflection rippled unnaturally, a subtle, wrong smile stretching across a face that wasn't quite mine. I tried calling out again, but the whispering returned, louder this time, brushing against my ears like wind. Through paper, it seemed to echo my thoughts, my fear, my attempts at reasoning. I stopped, pressed my hands to my ears, but it persisted, insistent, patient, as if it were waiting for me to surrender. The glow grew slightly brighter, and I thought I could see a faint outline of buildings ahead, maybe even a faint, familiar street corner. Relief washed over me briefly, but it was tempered by the sensation of something watching from just beyond. The periphery. I dared not look directly at the edges of my vision, but I could feel presence after presence, silent, patient, shifting like smoke in the corner of my mind. Finally, I reached the faint outline of a street corner, and the glow seemed almost normal, the city sounds returning softly, distant but recognizable. I dared to glance behind me, and for a moment my relief turned to cold dread. The street I had known was gone, completely gone, where it should have stretched behind me, filled with lampposts, shop fronts, and familiar pavement. There was nothing but darkness, infinite and unbroken. I staggered forward, adrenaline pushing me onward. Somewhere ahead, the glow solidified, the street returning slowly to recognizable shapes. But I knew, with a certainty that refused to be reasoned away, that the street behind me would never return, that the city I had known had abandoned me. And though I walked through familiar streets, past familiar shops and flickering lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness I had glimpsed lingered at the edges of perception, patient, waiting, and unyielding. Even now, when I walk at night, I glance over my shoulder more than I should. Sometimes, just for a moment, a shadow seems to stretch behind me in ways that shouldn't be possible. Sometimes the pavement glistens faintly, wet though the skies are clear, and I know, deep down, that there are streets in the city that vanish without warning, that reality itself can fold, leaving only the impossible behind, and that one day, perhaps, I may find myself facing another vanished street, unable to turn back. It was late in the evening, the kind of night when the city hums softly, and every streetlight seems to flicker with a life of its own. I had been walking home from work, my coat damp from a drizzle that had begun without warning. The rain fell, gently leaving tiny rivulets across the pavement and puddles that mirrored the scattered lights above. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional car passing in the distance, tires hissing through wet asphalt. I walked steadily, lost in thought, when I reached the familiar crossing near the old intersection I always passed on my way home. As I approached the pedestrian lights, I noticed her. She was standing to my side, just at the edge of the zebra. Crossing, I barely registered her, at first perhaps another late commuter, waiting for the signal to change. But as I drew closer, I realized she wasn't quite like anyone I had seen. She wore a long coat that seemed to absorb the dim light, darkening her figure against the glow of the street lamp. Her hair fell around her face in a way that hid her features, yet I felt, inexplicably, that she was looking directly at me, not with eyes that met mine exactly, but with some subtle, deliberate awareness that unsettled me deeply. I glanced away, pretending not to notice, telling myself it was just my imagination. The rain trickled softly around us, and the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and ozone. The traffic light changed to red, and the few cars waiting shuddered to a stop. Engines idling quietly, their reflections rippling in the puddles. I hesitated, feeling an odd pull, a quiet insistence that made my skin prickle. The woman remained beside me, silent, unmoving, yet her presence was unnervingly intimate. I had never felt someone so close without truly being aware of them. The pedestrian signal turned green, and I began to step onto the crossing. I looked to my side, intending to nod politely, maybe even comment on the weather, but she was gone. Completely gone. Not around the corner, not behind me, not anywhere I could see. One moment, she had been standing beside me, solid and real. The next, nothing. Only the faint scent of wet earth lingered where I imagined she might have been. My pulse quickened, but I rationalized it quickly. Perhaps she had stepped back when the light changed, blending with the shadows at the edge of the street. I continued walking, my steps echoing softly on the wet asphalt. The streetlights reflected in the puddles, painting fractured versions of the world around me, and for a moment, I thought I saw her again, a shadow flitting at the corner of my vision. I turned sharply, but the street was empty. No pedestrians, no figures, only the gentle hum of rain, the distant hiss of tires, putt, and the reflective puddles that seemed to distort the city into something unfamiliar. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, I had walked this route countless times, often alone, and yet that night, the air felt different, heavier somehow. Each step I took seemed to echo longer, stretching the familiar distance into something strange, as if the crossing, the intersection, and the street beyond had expanded subtly while I wasn't looking. I reached the far side of the crossing and paused, compelled to glance back. The intersection looked as it always had, the streetlights glowing softly, cars waiting in obedient rows, wet asphalt shimmering. Yet something was off. There was a subtle absence in the air, a silence beyond the ordinary hush of nighttime rain. It was a quiet that pressed against my chest, a vacuum where presence should have been. I had the distinct, chilling sensation that I had missed someone important. As I walked, I noticed little things. Puddles that hadn't been there before, rippling gently though the rain had stopped. Shadows that lingered just beyond the reach of the street lamps, not moving with the wind, not behaving naturally. The city felt aware, observant. I tried to focus on the familiar sights, shops with their late-night lights, the corner store with its neon sign, but everything seemed subtly warped, shifted. The air carried a faint hum, a sound like distant voices just beyond comprehension. I turned another corner, thinking that putting distance between myself and the crossing would settle my nerves. But every street I walked felt vaguely familiar, yet wrong. Intersections stretched further than memory allowed. Streetlights flickered at irregular intervals. Reflections in the wet pavement showed more than just my image. Sometimes, for the briefest instant, I saw her there standing just behind me, or to the side only for her to vanish when I blinked. I began to notice patterns. The hum in the air seemed tied to my steps. The reflections in the puddles sometimes lingered after I had passed, like echoes of moments that hadn't happened yet. My shadow occasionally stretched in ways that didn't align with the lamplight, forming elongated shapes that twisted subtly, too deliberate to be mere coincidence. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, yet the world remained calm, as if nothing unusual had occurred at all. Hours or maybe minutes passed. Time became untrustworthy. I walked, trying to retrace familiar routes, yet each block felt slightly altered. Corners sharper, street lamps lower, pavements slicker, canned. Still, I felt her presence, always at the periphery, just beyond direct sight. Sometimes, the faintest movement would appear in the reflection of a shop window or a puddle. A hint of a figure watching patiently, waiting. Finally, I reached my neighborhood, where the streetlights were warm, the familiar hum of late-night traffic comforting. I breathed a little easier, telling myself I had simply been anxious, exhausted, imagining figures in the rain. But as I turned onto my street, I noticed the crossing behind me again. The pedestrian signal glowed faintly green, even though it should have been red at this hour. And for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw her there again, standing exactly where she had vanished, her coat dripping rain, though the night was dry. I ran the last few steps home, locking the door behind me, leaning against it as if proximity to a barrier could keep the unease at bay. That night, I could not sleep. In dreams, I walked streets that were almost familiar, puddles shimmering, lights flickering, and she followed me, always sometimes visible, sometimes not, always patient. Even now, whenever I cross the streets late at night, I feel it, the faint, impossible sensation of someone beside me, waiting for the green light, vanishing the moment I look. The world seems ordinary enough. The rain falls as it should, yet for a heartbeat. I remember that crossing, the quiet calm of her presence, and the way she disappeared, leaving me to navigate streets that were somehow smaller, somehow emptier than before. And I wonder, every time, if one day I will reach the green light and she will not vanish at all. Goo. I had taken my usual late-night walk through the city that night, the streets glowing under the soft hum of streetlights, the occasional car slicing through puddles left from a drizzle that had stopped hours ago. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and something else I couldn't name, a metallic temps that seemed to cling to the sidewalks. My footsteps echoed softly, uneven against the uneven pavement, and I felt a familiar comfort in the quiet monotony of the city at this hour. It was a time when most people were asleep, and I liked it that with a solitude, the gentle hum of the urban night, the way shadows stretched long and lazy under the streetlights. I turned a corner into a small square, one I had passed many times. Normally it was quiet, the flickering lights of nearby shops and cafes reflecting off wet pavement, but that night something felt different. I paused, noticing a large digital billboard atop a building across the square. The screen glowed with the same soft blue and white light I had seen many times before, usually cycling through advertisements for restaurants, local events, or tourist attractions. But as I drew closer, I realized with a jolt that the screen wasn't showing an ad, it was me. At first, I thought it must be a trick of my tired eyes, a reflection in the glass of a nearby shop. Or maybe someone had set up a prank with a pre-recorded video. But no. The billboard played a video of me from tonight, walking along the streets just moments ago. My coat, the way I held my bag, even the small, unconscious gestures I made as I adjusted my hair, it was all there, displayed in real time, as if the screen were watching me. I stopped dead in the middle of the square, staring up at the enormous display. My own eyes blinked back at me from the screen, and a deep, creeping chill settled over my spine. I tried to shake it off, rationalizing that perhaps some security camera feed had been broadcast accidentally, some glitch in a nearby restaurant or store. But the more I watched, the more impossible it seemed. The video didn't show me from one angle it moved. It followed me, panning in ways that no fixed camera could, catching my profile, my back, even the way I adjusted my shoes as I walked. And I hadn't seen anyone else in the square. No one else taking pictures, no one standing on a balcony or in a window. My legs felt rooted to the spot, but some instinct deep inside urged me to move, to run. I turned slowly, glancing over my shoulder at the streets behind me, empty, quiet, safe. But the billboard continued to play my movements, my figure displayed in bright, glowing pixels, moments after I had actually performed them. Every subtle motion I made was mirrored almost instantaneously on the enormous screen above. I walked faster, trying to put distance between myself and the square, but the video followed, adjusting to my new path, always ahead or beside me. I dared not run, afraid that in my haste I might lose my footing on the slick pavement, but even in slow, deliberate steps, the sense of being observed gnawed at me. I glanced at every reflective surface. The glass of shop windows, puddles on the street, even the shiny metal of parked cars. I couldn't see anyone else nearby, but I could feel eyes, heavy and unblinking, pressing down on me. I ducked into a narrower street, hoping to escape the gaze of the billboard, to break the connection between the glowing display and my real self. The street narrowed, and the lights flickered more irregularly. I felt an almost physical pull, a tugging sensation in the back of my mind, as though the billboard wasn't just displaying me, but somehow drawing me toward it. My breath quickened, my chest tight, and I kept moving, careful to stay calm, to steady my pulse against the growing panic. The video on the billboard shifted then, subtly, almost imperceptibly. My face, which had always been neutral in the real world, now displayed a faint expression of fear, a half-formed grimace I hadn't made yet. My stomach churned. It was impossible. How could the screen know? How could it anticipate the subtle flicker of emotion, the twitch of my lips before I had registered it myself? I tried calling out to someone, anyone, but my voice was swallowed by the quiet night. The city seemed to hold its breath, the usual distant sounds of tires on wet asphalt, or the faint murmur of voices reduced to nothing. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, echoing down the empty streets. And I realized I could hear the faint hum of the billboard even as I moved further away, a low, vibrating presence that seemed to follow me through the concrete corridors of the city. I rounded another corner, hoping for an alley or a familiar street to shield me from the screen, but the feeling of being watched remained. I dared not look back, fearing the horror of seeing the video again, the way it would always be one step ahead of me. And yet, in my peripheral vision, I sometimes glimpsed the faint glow of pixels, a light that wasn't there, a reflection that wasn't mine. Hours or what felt like hours passed in slow, tense motion. Every street I turned into seemed subtly warped, elongated, unnaturally dark at the edges. Shadows lingered where they shouldn't, and reflections in the windows occasionally flickered with movement that didn't belong to me. I couldn't tell whether I was being pursued or if I had simply become part of some nightmarish trick of perception. Eventually, I reached the safety of a main street, one lined with traffic and the faint, comforting glow of open storefronts. The distant hum of life began to return, the occasional car, a distant laugh, the muted rattle of a bus rounding a corner. I slowed, trying to catch my breath, hoping the sense of being watched would fade, and for a moment, it seemed to. Then I heard it, the faintest click from above, a subtle shift of light. My pulse jumped. Across the square, the billboard had returned to normal. Advertisements for restaurants, local events, tourist attractions, safe, ordinary. But deep down, I knew it wasn't gone. It had only paused, waiting for the next moment when I would be alone, when the streets would fall silent again, when it could play its video once more. Even now, whenever I walk through that part of the city at night, I glance up, half expecting to see myself on the screen, moving before I have a chance to move, and I can't shake the certainty that it is still there somewhere, watching, recording, waiting. And I know, without a shadow of doubt, that the next time it plays, I might not be able to leave the square at all.